I'm Molly Morgan-Jones. I'm the Director of Policy at the British Academy. Thank you all for joining us today. I will be your chair and helping introduce each of the speakers who will all have wonderful things to share for this event today. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through some brief housekeeping. As the team has indicated in the chat function on the side of your screen, please use this as the main route to submit questions, provide any general comments, or post relevant links that might be of interest to others or that link to things that any of the panelists are saying. This discussion is being recorded and please keep your microphones muted at all times so we minimize the background noise. This is the second in a series of events we are using. This is the first time we within our policy team are using Zoom webinars as opposed to just the regular Zoom platform. So we really hope everything all goes to plan. But we are learning as we go, as everyone is at this time. So we would appreciate any feedback following the event. If you have any, and please do just get in touch with the team through the contact details you had when you signed up for the event. This event is part of our childhood program. As a bit of background about the event itself, children in the UK interact with both natural and urban environments in a variety of ways. And so this event will explore how children relate to different environments, the benefits that can be gained from these interactions, and how policy and policymakers can best enable and encourage children's positive relationships with different environments. As many of you will probably know, the British Academy is the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences. This event forms part of our childhood policy program, and the aim of our program is to reframe debates around childhood in both the public and policy spaces, and to break down academic, policy, and professional silos in order to explore new conceptualizations of children in policymaking. We do this by convening workshops, roundtables, and producing publications. And a lot of those in-person workshops, roundtables, of course, used to happen face-to-face, but now are happening virtually and actually are enabling us, we're finding, to draw in many more voices and perspectives and share these insights with a much wider audience. So thank you again to everyone who's joining, and we hope you enjoy the event. As I said earlier, this event today is the second in a series of panel discussions. The first session on how children engage with the digital online world took place in June 2020, earlier this year. And if you're interested in learning more about that event, please get in touch again with the team and you can find details on our Childhood Policy Program webpage. In the first part of this event, we're going to hear from each of our panelists. We're going to have two panelists kick us off who will be giving an overview of some of the provocation papers that they have written for the program and other insights they have. And then we'll have four respondents who will be giving their views in response. In the second part, we will then be responding to questions that all of you are putting to us. And so please do continue to submit questions in the chat function throughout the speakers part of the event, and then we will aim to answer as many questions as we can in the final 30 minutes. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Peter Craftel, Chair in Human Geography in the School of Geography at the University of Birmingham. And Peter's provocation paper, Including Children and Young People in Building Cities, explores how including children and young people from the outset of the planning process can help ensure that cities and urban spaces are child-friendly, meet children's needs, and encourage play in various forms. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Molly, Nicola, and everyone at the British Academy for organising this event. Can I just check you can see my screen?
It's got grey lines through it.
Oh, it doesn't on my view.
Maybe try advancing a slide and going back.
Won't let me advance the slide either. Let me just stop sharing and try something else. Is that better?
That's better, thank you.
Okay. Great. So thanks again. And I'd like, as Molly has mentioned, just to talk through some of the key points from my provocation paper about the inclusion of children and young people in building cities and other urban places. I want to start from two basic premises. The first is that it almost goes without saying that there's considerable urban growth around the world in different contexts. So in the UK, this might be in the context of a range of new house building projects, such as the current Garden Communities agenda led by Homes England, which will see the development of a series of new garden villages and communities. In India, the development of the 100 Smart Cities initiative, and a range of other initiatives which will see the development of cities and towns in different contexts. But the second premise is, despite all of the urban growth, and despite a huge amount of work by childhood studies scholars and advocates and policymakers, it's still the case that children's voices and needs tend to be underestimated and, if not ignored, in many of those programs. And that's also despite the prominence of the final of these images on the right there, UNICEF's Child Friendly City initiative. So it's within that context and within the importance of children's space within the urban public realm that my paper issued 4 provocations, which I'll just talk through in turn. The first provocation is that in the last few decades, a range of scholars and others have observed that children's mobilities, that is their movements around urban spaces, have appeared to reduce with a whole range of implications. But what I'd like to ask about is the ways in which we account for and attend to those kinds of mobilities. For instance, there's been a significant focus on what are termed independent mobilities, children's unaccompanied movements around towns and cities, and that's right. But on the other hand, as we have explored in some of our previous research, in new build urban settlements, children nevertheless still engage with their urban environments, spend time in them, and as we talked about, spend time literally just walking around them in various ways. And what we're interested in was the complexity of those movements, where children moved for play, for sociability, where they interacted with adults and also with other children, where they were accompanied by pets and others. So one of the things that we'd like to argue is that a focus on independent mobilities, unaccompanied mobilities, is important, but we also need to think about how that obscures some of the complexities of the ways in which children engage with the urban public realm. The second provocation is that we need to move beyond commonplace understandings of children's play in cities and urban places. Unfortunately, it's still the case that in the majority of these new build settlements, such as those that we've been working in, planning for play still means building playgrounds like the one you can see on the slide here. So the kind of kit designs, designs for younger children, rather than embedding play in various ways throughout the urban environment. And this is especially important where we still see children playing in places like waste grounds, on building sites where these new urban places are still yet to be developed, really echoing the work of the anarchist Colin Ward, who wrote about children's play on previously industrialized sites back in the 1970s and 1980s. So we'd like to ask here how we might not only account for, but plan for these kinds of play in waste grounds and meanwhile spaces in newly developing urban places. And I'd also like to push us to think about divorcing play from childhood, towards thinking about cities, towns as intergenerational playful spaces. What might those look like if we think not only about play for children, but for adults too? Thirdly, although there's been a lot of work, sort of formal work, trying to engage children and young people in planning processes in different contexts, there are a number of problems with that. Sometimes it's done in ways which are tokenistic, sometimes it's not done at all, and other times it can be quite successful. But beyond those kinds of formal participation in planning processes, I think it's also important to value the diverse urban knowledges that children and young people have, especially as they move into and grow up in these new urban spaces. So very briefly, the image you can see here is of a space called the Square in one of the urban developments we worked in England. And here, the developers were going to open up this space to the community once housing had been completed on all four sides. However, as a result of the global financial crisis and its aftermath, the housing wasn't completed, and children and young people began to kind of break through some of the barriers and play in this space, skateboarding, hanging out, doing all kinds of things. And ultimately, the developers actually took the decision to open this space for the benefit of the entire community. And this was a kind of tacit, unintentional participation that children and young people were involved in, which actually had positive benefits for the community. And we may also think about how children's diverse engagements, for instance, through different styles of just walking, may lead to diverse knowledges and practices in these newly emerging spaces. How children, because of their simple presence on the street, were the first to welcome new residents, or how they developed critical knowledges about the developers' intentions and failed promises in many of these new developments. Finally, I urge us to rethink the ways in which we think about natures in these kinds of spaces, where there have been significant efforts, for instance, in the UK Garden Communities Agenda, to create green urban spaces. We need to think about what kinds of natures we're valuing when we do that, and therefore what kinds of ecological futures we might be considering. But we also need to think really carefully about what we assume by the benefits of those natures in those spaces, especially for children. There's an underlying discourse that providing especially certain kinds of natural environments, such as woodlands, will be unequivocally good for all groups of children. Yet our work has shown that children's connections and experiences of natural spaces may be complex and situated. So for instance, we've contrasted experiences in Brazil with the UK, but even within a UK context, depending on one's background, one's experience, connections and experiences of nature may vary dramatically. I think that Nadia will pick up on some of those points in her presentation. So briefly then, the provocation paper ends with some implications for new and existing urban spaces. Firstly, to really recognise that children and young people are not only present in and important agents in urban spaces, and to recognise that they are still not really fully accounted for, but to recognise actually quite diverse engagements that they have with and in urban spaces, especially urban public spaces. Secondly, we really do need to keep considering ways in which we can foster children and young people's participation. And it's on this, and especially through really quite strategic, specific, practical mechanisms for doing so, that I've been doing lots of work with colleagues, especially in the UK context, and especially in the garden communities context, about what that might look like in practice. Thirdly, in terms of support, thinking about how we might support those more diverse forms of participation and knowledge that children have about the environment. How, for instance, we might provide support mechanisms for the kinds of critiques that they have of developers, or the ways in which they welcome new residents to urban spaces. And finally, modes of collaboration. So children and young people's voices and participation shouldn't be considered in isolation, but rather in intergenerational forms of conversation, intergenerational forms of influence around planning, and intergenerational community planning and development. Just seeing children and young people on their own, just trying to build child-friendly cities, is not the answer in and of itself. How that then translates into questions of urban childhoods, urban design, and urban natures in a time of global pandemics is, I think, an open question, and one beyond the research that we've had the privilege of doing so far, but perhaps a jumping off point for some conversation in the rest of today's webinar. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, for that really great opening talk, and a lot of thought-provoking things in there. Not only your last point about how we think about this in the context of a global pandemic, which I'm sure we'll come back to. I personally was really struck by divorcing play from children, and certainly in recent months have felt like every now and then you do just need to relax and play a bit to sort of cope with everything that's going on around us. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Nadia von Benzen. Nadia is a lecturer in human geography at Lancaster University. Nadia's provocation paper, The Need for Nature in the National Curriculum, focuses on how opportunities for engagement with nature need to be strengthened through better policy and therefore curriculum-based recognition of the holistic benefits of spending time outdoors. Curriculums that prioritized activities including play, practical learning, and physical work would work towards this outcome. So we will hear much more about all of this from Nadia. Over to you.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here today and to be speaking alongside some people whose work has been really formative in developing my own thinking around children and nature and those kind of broad questions, both in the kind of theoretical terms and in really practical terms. So my provocation paper looked at nature in the national curriculum, looking quite sort of broadly about children's relationships with nature and how those relationships might benefit from nature and aspects of nature being incorporated more centrally into the national curriculum in England and Wales. So the discourse that I expect most people here will be very familiar with is this idea of children being divorced from nature or an intergenerational decline in children's engagement with nature. And this kind of discourse around contemporary childhoods as lacking in nature experiences typically focuses on perhaps a variety of things, but two things mainly, I think. I think there's a strong discourse around the things that children are doing when they're not in nature, the things that children themselves are prioritizing. So particularly kind of screens and screen-based activity. So children are choosing to stay indoors because they would rather be watching the television, playing on the computer. And then also, as Peter kind of introduced in his presentation, this lack of independence. So a discourse that children are not spending much time in nature because they don't have much opportunity to engage with incidental nature. They are not walking themselves to school through a local park or through a local woodland. So they're not having a chance to, smell the daisies on those kind of incidental trips. And perhaps there's a slight irony here in that both the photographs were taken by my 4-year-old when he got hold of my smartphone at various points. But I thought those are brilliant illustrations of what I want to talk about. What you perhaps hear less about in this discourse is the extent to which children's experiences of nature are differentiated. So that's to say that all children are not experiencing nature to the same extent and in the same way. And I think one really important thing to recognize is the differences in experiences by poverty, by kind of wealth and class. So if you grow up living in urban poverty, then you are going to have fewer experiences to spend time in nature than children that grow up in middle-class families with access to cars, with access to urban green spaces, undertaking trips to the countryside. And similarly, we can see these differentiations through differences in racial, ethnic groups access, in differences between access for people who are disabled, and across kind of various identity differences. And this is a really important thing to talk about. Because of this discourse of intergenerational decline, we tend to see, or we tend to talk about, children's limited access to nature as being a contemporary phenomenon. We tend to think that this is a really new thing, that our grandparents and our great-grandparents, depending on our age, even our parents, had this kind of all of this access to nature spaces that suddenly our own children are not having. But actually my own work, looking kind of at historical childhood geographies, shows that for poor children growing up in urban areas, this has actually been the situation since industrialization. Since urbanization, there have been children who have had very limited access to outdoor green space. And one thing that I really want to come in and kind of caveat this discussion with at this point, again, building on what Peter was touching on, is that something that is often, again, missing from these conversations about children's contemporary relationships with nature is really a kind of critiquing of the notion of what is nature, what is this kind of magical space that we're imagining children should be in, and also why does it matter? Why are we bothered? What are we trying to get out of nature for children? And is there benefit to some of these things that children are doing instead? So we tend to think of the fact that children aren't sort of skipping through open fields as this really kind of negative, this kind of only a bad thing. But I think it's important to think, well, when they are accessing screens, when they are doing these kind of other things that our children are doing in a way that their grandparents and great-grandparents weren't doing, well, what are they replacing that with? What, and you know, can we look at translating any of the benefits to different environments? But that said, and that caveat aside, and something that I'm really happy to come back to you later, we are all aware, we're all sitting here, probably, or many of us sitting here, very aware of the benefits that do come from being in nature, and arguably the reasons why it's really important that children, that all children, have these opportunities. So I would argue not necessarily that they have to take them, but that it's important that young people have the chance to engage with outdoor green spaces. So we can divide up these kind of benefits in a number of ways, but I'd say one set of benefits is about physical benefits, about exercise, about developing gross motor skills, about the benefits for your immune system of kind of playing in the mud, opportunities for risk taking, which I'm sure is something that Tim's going to talk about more later, and opportunities for decision making, problem solving, experimenting with your body. You know, what happens if you shout in a cave? What happens to your shadow as the sun moves around? All of these things that arguably can be developed in other environments, but natural environments provide a really exciting opportunity for them to be explored and developed. We can also see natural environments, outdoor green spaces, as being full of opportunities for formal learning. So opportunities to kind of get up close and personal with living things. And slightly more kind of, or slightly less tangibly, we can see natural environments as a place for cognitive development. So children learn about ordering things, about categorizing things. And kinetic learning. So outdoor spaces can provide really exciting opportunities for doing normal kind of mainstream school subjects like English and math, but in a really kind of bodily, movement-oriented way, which can be really positive for some children's learning styles. We also see natural environments as opportunities for building lifelong connections. So children's access to outdoor green spaces has been really important as a way of developing a relationship between children and outdoor spaces that will go on to last into adulthood. Research shows that it's actually really important for those connections, that familiarity to take place in childhood in order for adults to feel comfortable in outdoor green spaces. And some research as well has shown that As adults, we're far more likely to behave in a pro-environmental way. We're far more likely to engage with recycling, to use our car less, to be worried about the environment, if we have developed those personal connections with outdoor green space. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, in fact, we understand there to be mental health benefits of spending time in outdoor green spaces, often linked to an understanding of these environments being relaxing and restorative. And that goes back to, or one theory is that relates to the fact that our kind of ancient ancestors were roaming the countryside, like, you know, the sort of environments in this picture, and that it's only in really modern times that humans have been living in cities, and that our brains aren't properly wired to deal with all the stimuli that we experience in our day-to-day lives, and that something about being in outdoor green spaces is important for our mental health and well-being.
If you could wrap up after this slide.
Sure, yeah, of course. If we understand all those benefits come from spending time in outdoor green spaces, it is therefore logical that there must be huge therapeutic potential. There must be the potential for outdoor green spaces to make a difference in the lives of children and young people, and particularly those children and young people that have fewer opportunities to do that in their day-to-day lives. There you go.
Great, thank you very much, Nadia, and again a wonderful set of issues and topics you have posed for us to come back to. We're going to move now to our 4 speakers who will both respond and set out key points on their views about this topic from their own experience. So we're going to start with Tim Gill. Tim is an independent scholar, advocate, and consultant on childhood, and author of No Fear: Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. Tim's work focuses on the changing nature of children's play and free time, and their evolving relationships with the people and places around them. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Molly. I'm just going to queue up a few slides, and I'll start with a slide. I will start with a slide that I think restates one of the things that Peter said about the limited progress, to say the least, on creating habitats for children that recognise their concerns and interests. And in fact, I would argue that we now need to strengthen the case. We need to look at other ways to build the case for more child-friendly built environments. And I think one of the things we need to realise is that the habitats that we're creating right now for children are really not working for them at all. And for a dramatic and tragic illustration of this, it's a case that with which I start my next book, Urban Playground, how child-friendly planning and design can save cities. And it's the case of Ella Kissi-Debra, who was living in my home city of London and who died as a result, in fact, of repeated asthma attacks, but where there is now a vital legal case going through the courts about which could lead to her death being attributed, the primary cause of death as being air pollution, which I hope, like me, you feel is a shocking indictment of city building. And of course, you can look beyond this case to other examples of how the built environment harms children. This chart shows you that despite the fact that we don't talk so much about road safety or child deaths anymore, they're still happening at an unacceptable rate across Europe, let alone the wider world. In fact, worldwide, traffic danger is the leading cause of death for children and young people between the age of, I think, about 5 and 29. And you can see here, even in Sweden, which would be held up as a world leader, I think, in many respects around road safety and public health. That's an astonishing statistic about the continuing problem of too many children dying on our streets. And this is also, it's something that has equity issues. You can see this graph here that shows dramatic social gradients for children living in poorer neighbourhoods compared to wealthier neighbourhoods in terms of their risk of being killed or seriously injured. And so when we say the places are safe now, I think we have to accept that what's happened is that we as a species have adapted to actually high levels of road danger. And one of the ways that we've done that is by restricting children's exposure to that danger. So I really think we need to recognise more strongly the adverse impact of poor design and planning on children right now around the world. And I also want to make the case for a new positive vision of what child friendliness means, and it's grounded in notions of children's everyday freedoms, and that's children's ability to explore, to get around. And the slide that you see now gives, I think, a dramatic illustration of how that freedom has shrunk over the generations. It's a slide that I use a lot, and it essentially illustrates how different generations of the same family gradually lost what you might call the right to roam in their city. So in taking forward this idea of everyday freedoms, I'm a big fan of the work of Marketa Kitter, who makes the case that child friendliness is really should be boiled down into two dimensions. On one dimension is what you might call things to do, which actually includes playgrounds, but as Peter and I agree, many other things as well, opportunities to see friends, to have contact with nature, and so on. But on the other axis, children's mobility, not just their independent mobility, but essentially the opportunities they have to access those offers. And it's only where you have both high levels of mobility and a lot of things on offer that you're up here in this quadrant of the diagram in a child-friendly city. Now, I think that this conceptualization of child friendliness has a lot of read across to what children actually tell us. And surprisingly or not, children are very consistent in what they say about what they like and don't like about the places where they live. And so I think maybe now the time, our primary task is not to keep asking them this question, but to get adults to care about what they say. And I've been lucky enough to spend time looking at a number of different cities, a baker's dozen of cities mainly in Europe and the Americas. And these are cities that have put serious time and money into the goal of making their built fabric more child-friendly. And what this Venn diagram shows you is that for many of these cities, there are essentially three themes, but around sustainability, around the economy, and around children's rights and health. But that for many cities, there are win-wins. And I think this is, if there's one thing I want people to take from this talk, it's that in making a strategic case for habitats for cities and neighborhoods to be more child-friendly, actually what we need to do is show and bring out the links with other strategic concerns. And perhaps the best example of that from the cities I visited is that, rather surprisingly, Tirana in Albania, where the mayor and the leadership there have in effect situated children as being the kind of symbolic holders of the future economically, socially, and environmentally of the city. That many of the city's policies are now being seen through the prism of children's eyes. And it's a real catalyst for strategic change in that city. And here's an example from the deputy mayor's Twitter feed of how, even in very challenging circumstances with not only COVID, but also the aftermath of the earthquake in Tirana, the administration is opening up space for child-friendly travel. So pulling that together, I think what we have is a response to a wider anxiety around the state of society. And that's captured in this quote here, that we need, and business leaders and city leaders are searching for ways to build a new collective and long-term vision about our futures. And I think the greatest attraction and potential of child friendliness and of seeing cities through children's eyes is of strengthening that case for a collective and long-term vision. And I'm going to close with two, I think, progress measures that I'm looking out for that help to build this case. So the first progress measure, it's really about that point of municipalities showing putting their money and their resources where their mouth is. And the model that I'm offering you, at the heart of the model of most of the cities that I had to visit and study, was a municipal official who had resources to make a practical, tangible difference. And my final slide pulls together what I like to think both make the case and measure progress on becoming more child friendly. I'm not going to read them out there, but they're kind of first person statements that I think capture both some of the messages that were coming from Nadia and from Peter, and distilling them into a form that could be a catalyst for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was excellent. And particularly that last slide, I know I'm probably not alone in wanting to study that in a lot more detail. And indeed, we might pick it up in the comments and questions later. We're going to move to Susan Aglenby, excuse me, sorry, I tried to practice beforehand, founder of Susan's Farm, which offers a range of educational experiences for children and young people. Susan has been farming in Cumbria for 25 years, and she's passionate about sharing skills and knowledge with young people, adults, and community groups. The farm hosts a wide variety of educational visits for children, including for young people with learning disabilities, challenging behaviors, or mental and physical health problems. So Susan, we are very much looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I haven't got wonderful pictures of our cattle and sheep and the geese and the hens. But all I can say to all of you, you'd be very, very welcome to come and visit us, because it's only by coming to see and be on a day when the young people are there and just what they experience. So Susan's Farm is a care farm in northeast Cumbria, just 2 miles north of Carlisle city centre. All the teenagers who are referred to the farm have already been excluded from school, are school refusers, or in danger of being excluded. Just occasionally, a very perceptive teacher will notice that a young person is just not fitting into normal school setting, and will seek out an alternative revision for that student, knowing that the young person is interested in the out of doors, farming, or working with animals. Such a perceptive teacher, I would say, is aware of the amber lights flashing. Sadly, too often, when a student finds their way to the farm, the light has already turned red. And it is then an enormous challenge to engage that student with any kind of formal learning, even calculating how many fence posts the farm needs to buy to fence a 250-metre length with a post every 2 metres is a huge challenge. The reason for a late referral may well be because of financial constraints on the school is under. However, a full-time place at a pupil referral unit, PRU, is a great deal more expensive than a day a week on the farm. Prevention is far better than cure. And I was a nurse for 43 years. I've worked in acute medicine, I've worked in community medicine. And, you know, it is a huge challenge working in community medicine, both from the young person's perspective and economically for us all as taxpayers. Prevention is better than cure. An early referral to the farm, often the schools tell us that the student then attends and engages with school the remaining 4 days of the week. Carlisle is a very small city. Population approximately 65,000. Yet many children, young people who visit the farm have never had the opportunity or been allowed to splash in puddles or squelch in mud. Experiencing the rural environment is a totally new experience for them, and they can run across a grass field provided there are no stock in it. And the value of this experience just cannot be underestimated. we have a small 2-acre wood in which our education officer runs a series of sessions called Living in the Woods. To the children, this small wood is a forest. To be allowed the freedom to explore this wood is very special. So what's so special about Susan's farm? Those of us who work there are convinced it's working with stock, sheep, cattle, hens, and geese. From day one on the farm, a belligerent teenager who's definitely a square peg in a round hole in a conventional school setting is immediately in awe of our longhorn cattle and very quickly learns to treat them with respect. When working in a pen with the cattle or sheep, the young people learn being kind yet firm with the stock. We persuade them to go where we want. Screaming, shouting, and violence have no part to play on Susan's farm. On a stock farm, students experience the wonders of new life and also of death. Giving the effing and blinding boys from the Prue a dead lamb to bury is very revealing, sobering, particularly when they have struggled to keep that lamb alive. It is important on these occasions to make the time to answer their questions. Without knowing it, they are verging on the borders of ethics, philosophy, and religion. The beginning of life to many is a miracle. Watching a lamb being born, the mother licking it, and within 5 minutes, it's standing on its 4 feet to suckle. Those of us who work on the farm must be willing and prepared to answer all the questions thrown at us. Being an organic pasture for life farm, all our cattle and sheep are out all the year. They need checking every day and feeding every day for 5 months of the year. Our longhorn cattle appear fierce and intimidating. However, they're gentle giants. Learning to observe and respect these animals does an enormous amount for the self-esteem and confidence of the wayward teenagers we are working with. What a joy it is for us to see these macho lads who at first are fearful of these beasts, moving confidently amongst them after a few weeks. Nadia, in her paper, I know, touched on the effect of COVID-19. Carlisle is not a large urban conurbation. However, we have already seen some of the effects of lockdown. Our small 2-acre community wood was invaded by a gathering of teenagers, playing loud music, tearing branches off the trees to make dens, frightening the neighbours. These young people have found lockdown very challenging. And it is only the tip of the iceberg. Maybe some of you heard Michael Morpurgo last Friday evening on Radio 4's A Point of View, speaking very eloquently about the effect of lockdown on our young people and the need for a truly holistic approach to education, which includes experiencing the out of doors, the natural world, in wind, rain, sun, and snow. Weather in which us fortunate farmers experience and are working in 365 days of the year. The realization to the young that we are working with that, whatever the weather throws at us. We are out there caring for the stock and the land. They soon realize what a privilege it is to be able to do this. They learn as much about themselves, their companions, leadership, and teamwork, and about the natural world around them. Whether the child, young person, is engaging with the natural environment in the community centre in Meanwhile Gardens, at the bottom of Trillick Tower in North Kensington, or feeding sheep on Susan's farm, the value of this experience to their health and well-being cannot be overestimated. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was wonderful. And I feel like I could picture myself there and everything you've said. And I hope one day I might be able to visit personally. But thank you. That was wonderful to share with us those experiences and some of the challenges you're currently facing, or your community is currently facing. Next, we're going to go to Judy Ling Wong, who is a poet, painter, and environmentalist, best known as the honorary president of the Black Environment Network. Judy was the UK director of the Black Environment Network for 27 years. She has an international reputation as a pioneer and creator in the field of multicultural participation in the built and natural environment. Judy, over to you. I think we need you to...
Good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to respond to Peter and Nadia. Our cities are increasingly multicultural. Last week, the Architects Journal wrote about how Enfield Council has decided to use the clout of public sector regeneration money, £6 billion of it, to push the architectural community to address diversity and equality elements and social value in design. Only firms that team up with a 50% Black and ethnic minority-led practice, a 50% women-led practice, and a local outfit from Edmonton will be eligible to bid for Meridian Water's latest commission to deliver 800 rented council homes at the heart of their master plan. They wish to see the profession recognize the value of lived experience and identification with the neighboring community's 60% Black and ethnic minority composition. Meridian Water boss Peter George says they cannot afford to ignore a growing public sector client with increasing demands and expectations with regards to equality, diversity, and social value. This way of thinking and operating, no doubt emboldened by the impetus of the Black Lives Matter movement, is significant in the context of Peter's assertion of the need to shape environments that meet children's needs within such master plans that are set within areas of highly diverse populations. This initiative recognizes the need to push design and other professionals to transform their working practice. As part of this, key segments of the community must be included and consulted, such as children that are usually marginalized, as pointed out by Peter. It will be a challenge to put into place an ongoing program of support for groups such as children to nurture and enable them to be effectively articulate and articulate the knowledge and experience that they hold about their needs and their wishes, so that the complexities may be understood and more opportunity provided across a great range of spaces beyond formalized activity spaces. This is much needed. Examples of good practice, setting standards, and with serious investment to underpin structural actions are important, as pointed out by both Peter and Nadia. We keep seeing exemplars come and go, often dismantled before they reach their full potential. At one time, a consultative group of children aged 4 to 16 was funded by City Hall in London, supported by a development worker. To have that range of ages, there were brothers and sisters in the group. The children became very skilled over time, making valuable input into themes ranging from domestic violence to access to green spaces. But it was dismantled as part of austerity measures, taking away something extremely valuable at a time of challenge to the lives of disadvantaged groups. In the context of green spaces, the children said that many of them were put off using green spaces because these spaces were of poor quality and had no interesting activities. There's a lot to do to increase the potential of green spaces as multi-use spaces serving children and community. Burgess Park, serving the adjacent social housing estates that are the largest in the whole of Europe, is a success story of what can be achieved with substantial investment to upgrade a green space to serve the local community. £8 million was invested with a state-of-the-art BMX track, a lake with fishing, wildlife gardens, exercise frames, tennis courts, cafe, library, beautifully designed meadows, beekeeping and food growing, cultural festivals, play areas, and massive spaces for free play. You name it, they have got it. And recently, new flats have been completed with roof gardens. Surveys found local people on average spending 3 hours in the park. Beyond the overall policy and vision, attention to the characteristics of local spaces and people are fundamental to successfully meeting their needs. With a severe lack of green spaces in the poorer and more diverse areas, provision within schools, such as that proposed by Nadia, is an important intervention, particularly if stimulating activities are creatively linked to learning outcomes. Excellent programs of activities for outdoor learning are already being run in various schools, nature reserves, and in local parks by schools themselves and a range of voluntary sector environmental organizations. An immediate and effective action for significant impact on children's lives is to replicate at scale these examples of good practice. Linking outdoor activities to national curriculum is an incentive for schools to take up successful and enjoyable programs such as Forest School and Natural Thinkers. The cost of training and adaptation to school conditions are also factors. Natural Thinkers is a primary school program created by early years specialists within Lambeth Council with deliberately low training costs and adapted to the limitation of urban school grounds. It has demonstrated the raising of whole school educational outcomes. The National Children's Bureau is so impressed with its achievements and cost effectiveness that it is supporting the national rollout of Natural Thinkers schools. There are always new horizons. With COVID-19, children's outdoor activities have been severely curtailed and digital learning has come to the fore, but has also shown us that disadvantaged communities are technology poor, with many children having no laptops or broadband in their homes. To address the issues and take on the ideas put forward by Peter and Nadia, segmented research and local research is needed to drive evidence-based policy and enable effective implementation for specific groups in specific localities. In our increasingly multicultural cities, addressing equality and diversity is fundamental, alongside layers of issues such as unsuitable housing, food and digital poverty, lack of mental health services, perceived safety, the destructive impact of stop and search, loans for university education, or generational factors, as they collectively impact on the key themes that Peter and Nadia have highlighted, with disproportionate effect on Black and ethnic minority children, young people, and other vulnerable groups. It is very disappointing to have good things done in one sector undone by negative things happening in an area of children's lives. Hungry, unhealthy children will not do well even within the best of programs. Recently, the Black Lives Matter movement has given phenomenal impetus to issues of diversity and equality. It is a message about an integrated approach to whatever we want to happen. It is a significant historical moment, an opportunity for push for progress. Years ago, the Conservation Trust volunteers, the largest volunteering nature conservation organization in Europe, did a staff survey and found that those who work with the most disadvantaged groups had the greatest job satisfaction. Working with the disadvantaged is joyous work. They love seeing the transformation of lives. Finally, I would like us to bring to mind that working for diversity and equality is not about doing a favor to particular groups of people. It is about a cohesive and inclusive vision of society of which we can all be proud. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Judy, for those really both important and inspirational words, and bringing that inclusivity, the things about segmented, local, research and integrated approaches to the forefront. Finally, our last speaker is Matt Larson-Daw, Education Manager at WWF UK. WWF is the world's leading independent conservation organization. Its mission is to create a world where people and wildlife can thrive together. They work to inspire children and young people to care about the natural world, to help them explore the issues facing our planet, and to equip them to take positive action to protect it. So Matt, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be part of such an inspiring panel today. As you heard, my role is Education Manager at WWF UK. So we're an organisation that's guided by science and inspired by nature, and our remit goes far beyond that sort of direct conservation work to protect and restore landscapes. It's about trying to reach that point when people are in harmony with nature and all of what that means. So this idea, some of the ideas that have already been explored by the other speakers are really key to our mission, particularly mine in the education department. Nadia mentioned this building up of a connection to nature through time spent outdoors. Absolutely key, and that means that a lot of our early years and primary work is just focused at enabling and supporting teachers and to a certain extent parents to be able to give those opportunities to young people. We know that we reap the dividends down the line. Those young people reap immediate benefits, but also that's the way that we will build engaged young people with a passion for nature and a desire to stand up for it when they see it threatened. So a lot of this resonates with me. So one of the things that's really important in our work is we have to look at the global picture. We're talking about things like biodiversity loss and climate change. These are global issues, and they can be very hard to comprehend for anyone, but especially for young people, because they seem so distant and so macro in their scale. So these key messages that we often want to embed, and these values and this idea of acting in a sustainable way and in harmony with nature, they are best fostered at the local level through direct experience of local environments. So this really is a webinar subject that is very close to my heart. So I want to come at these provocations from my role as an educator and as a nature campaigner. I'm just going to make a couple of remarks really in response to some of what we've already heard, and then just focus on one new area for a couple of minutes at the end. So the first point I was really keen to make was that young people, the younger, the more significant this is, they are always doing two things at all times. They are playing and learning. So one might be more visible than the other. Both might just be sort of internal, if you like. But for younger children, especially, the two are one and the same. And this means there is a bit of a limitation to the very concept of, for example, play areas or playgrounds, where you fence off an area with the function of play, because of course, young people will be playing and learning from that play wherever they are. There is a purpose for them, of course. They ensure there is a space that's safe, dog mess free, that there's equipment there to enhance social and individual play in a limited space. You know, that's all really important, but we shouldn't consider a child's needs to have been met by this fenced area in which they may spend no more than 1 hour a day. And for a child, since every moment is a learning moment, that means that no activity is purely functional. Young people are not on their way to work or traveling. They may be walking to school. Their heads won't entirely, in most cases, be thinking of the school day ahead. Children tend to live a lot more in the moment. And so looking at design of spaces outside children's play areas with a perspective on the child's experience, it's really important that we don't really get sucked into purely purpose-led design. Purpose-led design can be really pleasing, particularly for adults with a design eye. They can see how things have been engineered to allow a particular experience, but young people will inevitably find their own pathways, find their own ways to interact. My daughters have a whole array of footballs. I don't think either of them have any interest in kicking it into a goal. They're either dragon eggs or giant berries, depending on the game being played. The play area that you can see there is our local one. That slide is very infrequently slid down. It's very frequently climbed up. So free play is really important. It's how children learn. And we need to look at spaces that children are going to be interacting with that in mind. It's about the experience in the moment rather than about how well it delivers on what we perceive to be the main purpose of their time there. So inevitably, I'm a great believer in the importance of interactions with nature. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Nadia said and won't repeat it in terms of the benefits of time spent in nature. And I think when purpose and this idea of an agenda to design go out of the window, we can actually experience the world as a child does. I think some of us have been forced to kind of do that by lockdown, by suddenly having our normal schedule interrupted and our agenda subverted. And suddenly we might find ourselves hanging around places where we wouldn't normally feel we had a reason to. And of course, then we can start to experience in the moment in the way that children inevitably do. And there are such small things that can make the big difference, but the presence of nature in an urban space or access to nature outside that urban space is one of the really key ways that that rich learning experience can actually be experienced by a young person. So that's this kind of idea of learning from nature. An Albert Einstein quote there, which most of you I'm sure will be familiar with. So what's really important to our remit at WWF is that building this nature connection is vital. We want the campaigners of the future, but that's nature connection is often summarized or simplified as building a love for nature. And we know that it's really, really important as well to ensure that children understand nature and what they're seeing in their natural environment. We developed with iNaturalist, a citizen science platform, an app called Seek, which is free and available. And the idea behind this was to provide young people with a sort of doorway into a greater level of complexity in the nature that they experience just through walking to school, spending time in their garden. It identifies any wildlife that you pointed at. And I think technology has been used before to bring young people out outside and involve them in activities, and the benefits we're seeing, well, they're outside, they're in the fresh air and so on. But actually, often it becomes a barrier to sort of experiencing the full complexity of that natural environment or the natural elements of the environment. Seek aims to actually do the opposite, and by giving them the incentive to go outside because it's something which is exciting, technological, and there's a slightly gamified element to it. They are actually inspired to dig a little bit deeper, find details that they might overlook otherwise, and then find out more about those creatures or plants that they discover. And I think this is the kind of learning experience that can be absolutely key. And I want to conclude this sort of short talk in response to the provocations with the point that schools have an important role to play. And that's because of this idea that young people can learn from their experience in a space and actually building up a complex understanding and a systems thinking idea of the natural world that they're interacting with is as important as them spending time outside and enjoying it and building up that connection and that love for it. Schools are microcosms of society, and they are landowners. They have school grounds for the most part, or access to local areas with permission from local authorities to access and use them. They have a huge opportunity, and we have a teacher training course that's out at the moment that's free, Education for a Sustainable Planet, and it looks at this whole school approach to bringing sustainability into education, education for sustainable development. And it recognizes that schools have this huge ripple effect across society. It's not just about what students learn from their time in classrooms, and even not just what they take back to families and what they do in the future. It's also a business that has this school grounds, and you can make decisions in a participatory way with young people in a way that not only gives them a really important learning experience and involves them in understanding how landscapes can be shaped and developed through decision making, but it also helps them to actually build a sense of ownership in that landscape and to actually take learning forward into their own lives. So there's just 4 points I wanted to leave you with on the role of schools really in all of this, because it hasn't really been picked up too much by other speakers. So one is that schools can play a really important role in leveling access to nature experiences. A few of the speakers have mentioned, you know, it's really, it differs enormously how different young people in different families and contexts can access nature. And so at school, you can make sure that an entire community of young people is accessing, and the government can play a key role in ensuring that it's supported, and schools are actually enabled and persuaded to do that. They can model positive action in the use and the design of outdoor space. That's great for the young people who experience that outdoor space, but then also they can take forward into their lives through the skills they gain. They can involve young people in design decisions, and they can build an understanding of that connection between people and landscape that's absolutely key going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you once again to all of our panelists for such thought-provoking comments and presentations to get us going. We're now going to spend the next 24 minutes trying to get through as many questions as we can from all of you, and there are some really great ones. I'll start with one that came right at the beginning, and it was addressed to Peter, but I think actually any one of the speakers could touch on it, because I think you all spoke to it in one way or another. But what do you think of the idea that children are so unwelcome in so many public spaces that we need play equipment or some other physical signal to legitimize their presence among a wider public? So perhaps, Peter, you could start, but then if anyone else wants to come in, please do.
Yeah, I think that is an important point, and I guess it's a wider point, just touching on Judy's response about the ways in which our urban environments can signal overtly and explicitly that they're inclusive. But of course, that symbolism shouldn't just be a form of symbolism or tokenism. If it's going to be there, then it needs to have been built in through the appropriate kind of processes of participation and engagement with diverse communities, and kind of understood as a local thing, rather than, I think, simply having, for instance, a set design playground which looks the same everywhere. That's one kind of symbolism. I don't think it's the kind of symbolism that's as meaningful as the kind of more detailed, rich kinds of processes that Judy was talking about. So I think, yes, it could work if it's symbolic of those kinds of processes, but it wouldn't work alone either, because a child-friendly city really, and I think this is what Tim was saying, would only really be child-friendly if it were accessible, if it enabled movement, if children, young people's voices were heard, and if that were embedded in the whole city. So I guess perhaps we wouldn't need those symbols were that city to be more inclusive in a more holistic sense.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add thoughts? Nadia.
Sorry. Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question, and what really struck me is that it's not necessarily the children that need the kind of symbolism written into the landscape to say, it's okay, you can play here. It's their parents. It's anyone who's looking after the children, because, you know, many of us will have that experience that kids, you know, I think Matt was mentioning this just now, that kids don't care who or what or why something is in the environment. It's the rest of us that have been socialized in a particular way to think about particular behaviors happening in particular spaces. So it's the rest of us that need the reassurance that it's okay, and also that we're not going to be blamed if it goes wrong, if something happens.
Great, thanks. Anyone else before I move on? Tim.
Yes, really just taking on the point that Nadia made, I think it's interesting to me that a number of the cities that I visited are really rejecting the idea of the compartmentalized, fenced off, reservation for children of the conventional fixed equipment playground, and their guidance and their policy and their investment is going into the creation of more inclusive, attractive, engaging, sociable places that people of all ages will find attractive. But I think there still needs to be a kind of if you like, play cues or play signals. So that means that there may still be a place for equipment, but the context within that equipment, within which that equipment is placed, is less rigid, and it's a rejection of what some of us call the KFC model, so the kit, fence and carpet model of the public play area, in favour of a richer and more inclusive model.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Judy?
Yes, I really want to talk about secret spaces. You know, nowadays we have spaces where we are so aware of safety, you know. You've got to have lights on, you've got to see through every space, you've got to see exactly where the child is and things like that. It really doesn't do well for children's development to be creative, have a sense of privacy, to be with their own very small groups of friends in a place that they think is private. So I think creating a critical minimum number of spaces in the locality where children can go to and we know they're safe. For example, Roots and Shoots in Kennington has a very beautiful, very small but very beautiful urban wildlife. You have to sign in, they know you are in it, but once you're in it, you're on your own. Now that is a wonderful experience to have. So spaces like that is important. And of course, giving status to children. For example, another project, Coram Fields, which you would know, is that adults are not allowed in without a child. It goes in reverse. So giving status to children, making them feel important, attending to their needs for secrecy as well as joint community activity, I think is important for spaces.
Yeah, that's really great points to remind us of. Matt or Susan, anything to add before I move on to Susan?
I actually just typed a little thing in the answer there, but yeah, just to say, to back up what's been said by a couple of speakers there, that closing off of those areas actually adds to that sense of them not being welcome elsewhere, so that making all landscapes feel like there's you know, they've been designed for children as well, just is that really important visible cue. I think it's been said.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And Susan?
And having been talked about the negative aspects of lockdown, and we have indeed seen them, and I think there are going to be a lot of mental health issues coming our way. A benefit has been that an enormous number of people have explored the countryside around them. Instead of having tens of people walk the footpath and permitted footpath across our farm, we have had hundreds, if not thousands, during the period of lockdown. And what is exciting is that children who have done the course of living in the woods, who know about our woods, then bring their families to experience. You know, a community wood is a very important resource that everybody can go there all the time. Yes, we don't want it damaged by these frustrated, locked-in children or teenagers who did damage to it. But on the other hand, it is a resource there for the whole community, and it's not a large area. And I think we've got to see the benefits of one of our mental health adults who comes to the farm every week. He is highly intelligent, very poorly. He has written a wonderful poem during lockdown about goldfinches that he saw in the hedgerow while he walked to the farm. You know, there's some good has come out of this terrible time that we're in at the moment.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you, Susan. I'm going to take us to our next question, sort of a related point as we're talking about spaces. There's currently a UK government white paper seeking views on the reform of the land use planning system. Do any of the panel have views on what they would like to see changed in the planning system for the benefit of children and young people? And I guess we could link it to another question that's been asked about, are there ways of either, you know, face-to-face or in groups or digitally or through social media, allowing children and young people to participate in providing some of those views that might be taken into account? Anyone want to tackle that? Tim?
I'm still getting my head around the proposals from the government, but I think two things that I think we know already. One is that a functioning planning system needs functioning planning departments, and we don't have a lot of those at the moment. And you know, there's a real problem, I think, around just the sort of basic capacity and competence of lots of municipal planning departments. I also think that any reform of the planning system really has to take seriously our climate adaptation target. I see little evidence of that right now, and you know, anybody who, you don't have to look very hard at what net zero means to realize the implications. And by the way, in case you missed it, one of the strongest, in fact, I think the strongest argument, strategic argument for creating more child-friendly places is that, in simple terms, a child-friendly neighborhood looks like a sustainable neighborhood. And there's a lot, that's a very helpful way to make the positive case for us all to be walking and cycling more, having green space on our doorsteps, having more compact communities. And I would want to see that brought out in any planning reforms as well.
Thank you. Peter.
Yeah, I agree with everything Tim's just said, and I'll just build on this with, I guess, some more specific points about things that we've been doing with local authorities who are delivering new developments, and also with developers, because I think it's not just about planners, it's also about the developers who ultimately fund, build, and very often are now involved in the master planning of those sites. There is a piece to do around how we influence those developers through working with planners. But two things that we have been doing. One is advocating for something that looks like what's known as a supplementary planning document, an SPD, which is a statutory document that sets out principles for not only engaging with children and young people, but a series of kinds of principles of the like that Tim's presented with those kind of 10 kind of criteria. Which then becomes something that can't be escaped. It's something that then structures some of the planning processes from an early stage, and that's something we're actively working on co-developing with some planning authorities. The other is really supporting planning authorities who would like to engage with children and young people but don't know how. And we're one of a group of many academics and advocates who are providing resources and support for doing that, either working directly with them or providing signposting to resources for doing that. So I think there is a will there amongst some groups. To what extent we can get that back into the white paper and that kind of level of policy making is unclear, but that's something that we could actively support.
Thank you. Anyone else want to pick up on this point before I move to the next question? Judy.
I want to come back to consultation. I think that really structurally, for policies to have the sort of input we want, local areas and local authorities have really seriously to consider building in ongoing capacity building of communities in order to become consultable. And it's not instant. We've been taking part in consultations and council estates and so on, and people would say things to us like, oh, we want it to be better, but we don't know what. You know, people are not instantly consultable. They have to be nurtured in this. And when you talk about spaces and design and so on, people who are so ghettoized in their own spaces, they've never seen good design. So taking people to different spaces and so on makes them have a vocabulary and an experience to refer to, which makes them consultable. They begin to be able to dream about what they really need because there's a range of examples that stimulates their own imagination and so on. You know, there are examples of good practice as well. For example, Bankside Open Spaces Trust in London, they have developed such a great representation of the local community that every developer that comes in, they go and speak to them and negotiate about what they're going to do and what the community actually wants out of them. And they've developed such a good relationship in the local area that if needed, they have the capacity to knock on every door. That is an amazing capacity. Now, this very small group never had the capacity to teach others to do this. I actually at one time talked to them and said, this is wonderful. Shouldn't you be sharing this and teaching others? They said, well, they don't pay us. They want us to do it free. We have no time and so on. So having examples that can be cascaded and funded to cascade and build these ongoing representation by young people and community, I think is crucial to the success of policies.
Thank you, Ju. I think that's a wonderful point, and applies across so many policy areas, not just the ones we're talking here. I'll certainly take that point away. Matt, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on what Judy said, really, the importance of making sure people are consultable, because I think consultations are often done, as a bit of a showpiece, and they can be a bit tokenistic, and that applies double-fold with young people. So while my instinct, in response to any government consultation is that, we really want young people to be given the opportunity to engage in it meaningfully, often when opportunities are created for young people to have input, it is just a good news story that doesn't really affect things. But it is possible, and Judy's examples are great. And there's a school in Essex that we've worked with called Riddle Junior School that you can look up, and they embarked on a whole school project to define a new learning pod. So they knew they wanted one anyway, but they decided rather than just go through a process of defining it and having it built, they involved students. In fact, students led the process right from day one. It took a long time as a result, but every stage was a hugely valuable learning experience for young people. So they went from just kind of consultation style brain dumps of what they would like from this and what their priorities were, through to coming up with designs for the what it would look like, where it would go. And at each stage, they had experts in to make sure that they were led by expertise, and even the planning application was led by young people with support from people to make sure that it was done properly. And so, by the end of that process, they understood all the nuances that you kind of really need to have in your head if you're going to meaningfully respond to a consultation on changes to land use planning. It can be done. If it's not done, I would question its value. I think they need to be considered as really important stakeholders, but their needs need to be interpreted by experts. But it can be done, and if it is, it's so valuable.
Thank you. Next question is, many speakers have picked up on a sort of strategic link between the provision of play with economic aims. In communities that are marginalized, where there is limited funding for social infrastructure, how realistic is it that the creation and provision of outdoor spaces will be seen as economically beneficial? Peter.
Just waiting to see if anyone else wanted to speak, because I know I've said quite a lot.
I think the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll be quick though. So some of the work we've done with developers, as well as planning authorities, some developers are beginning to recognise that if they build spaces that are child friendly, and if they build spaces that are inclusive and offer opportunities for amenities and green spaces, actually, it sounds terrible for me as a critical social scientist to say that, they will also benefit economically, because in bare terms, it will ensure that their communities are more desirable. It may well mean they are able to sell houses on these new developments. And it means that people will become more attached to them, and senses of community will develop there. So there is an economic case to be made, but also the investment they have to put in is, economically speaking, quite small for what are huge social and cultural gains. So I think the two can go hand in hand. They're not in opposition. As I say, it pains me to say this as a kind of critical social scientist, but that is a reality.
Yeah, thank you. I'll move to, we're running out of time, so I think we've had time for one more question, and we'll link it to sort of the current context, and especially end of last week and this week, as I'm sure those of us with children who are we're seeing kids back in school. I would love to hear this, attendee said, I would love to hear panelists' responses to the idea that COVID may now mean reduced time outdoors at schools, especially secondary schools, and much more regimented and controlled use of their immediate environments. Is the place of policy to address what kind of experience of outdoor spaces young people have in schools? So I don't know who would like to tackle that one first. Nadia.
I'm so glad we got to this one, because I sort of filibustered myself out of my final slide, which I was kind of hoping to address COVID and nature in the curriculum and how that might affect it. So I think very briefly, not really to answer the question, but to agree that this is such a fundamental and interesting question moving forward. For me, a really great sadness was that at the outset of the pandemic, and as we started to talk about after lockdown, as we started to talk about how will we get kids back to school, the initial, certainly the Scottish response was, we're going to educate outdoors, we're going to develop outdoor classrooms, or at least that was what the media picked up on. And that to me was so exciting. I thought, oh yes, great, this is going to be a really interesting development in education. And then the money didn't appear, the support didn't appear to do that. And what we've ended up with is this kind of understanding of outdoor spaces as dangerous because they can't be managed. We can't ensure children behave in a particular space when they're outdoors. We can't stop children mixing, and therefore we have to keep children indoors in order so that we can manage their bodies effectively. And I guess for me, that's a really interesting reflection on broader concerns about children and allowing children to play outside more generally. The fact that once children go outside, they're then very difficult to manage, they're very difficult to control. So it's really interesting for me to see this playing out in the current situation as well.
Thank you, Nadia. I think that's really interesting, and indeed interesting in light of the fact that lots of evidence about controlling not people but the virus is about being in well-ventilated outdoor spaces as well. Matt?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to it, but I'm probably going to say the same thing, so I'll be brief. But yeah, just to say that it is clear the science supports spending more time outside, and it's crazy that because of a lack of clear guidance from the current government, but also this idea that you can ensure a sort of distance by having markers on the floor and so on, it becomes difficult to do that outside, that we're likely to see that actually diminished. So WWF has been talking to Learning Through Landscapes, who have a really relevant report that was not a response to COVID. It was around before that, that really just tries to build confidence in teachers just with the resources that they have and the outdoor space that they currently have, without any investment, without any CPD, just to kind of give some clear guidance and some support and some confidence building to get outside with their students. And we're hoping to release that in the lead up to Outdoor Classroom Day in October or November, to release it with a COVID slant jointly, because it's incredibly important. And actually this could be an opportunity, as it has been through people's experience in lockdown, for schools to rediscover or to discover in some cases for the first time just how valuable getting students outside for lessons can be. And just as a sort of kicker to that, there's an observation I was meaning to put into my talk, which was the Nature Connections project, which I know most of you will be aware of. That there was a report, evaluation report that was, I'm afraid I can't remember which university led on it. I'm sure Tim will know. But the title, working title for that report throughout the Natural Connections project was Transforming Schools Through Outdoor Learning, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. When it finally came out, it was sadly changed to Transforming Outdoor Learning in Schools, kind of put it in a box. But what we'd really like to see is this understanding that that leading with let's be as outside as possible can just bring huge benefits across teaching, and in this case for health and management of health.
Thanks, Matt. And Susan has had to go as we approach the end of our time, so we will sort of thank her in her absence. But really fascinating set of final reflections there. And I know just personally I'm an N of one, but my children's school in our village has actually made it very explicit there will be a lot more outdoor time to send children in with all sorts of whether to prepare for that. So I wonder if this is yet another example of where we're going to see growing inequalities between different people's experiences and different environments, and that certainly should not be something that we should sit idly by. There are, my notes say I'm to offer a set of reflections. There are so many, and I certainly could not do it nearly as eloquently as all of the panelists who are here have done so today. So I will just say thank you very much again to all of you for your insights and your thoughts and giving your time. And thank you as well to all of our attendees. We've had people who've had to drop off to pick up their own children or to go to other events, but we did have close to over 130 people at one point listening in from, it looked like, many different parts of not only the UK but the world. So thank you to all of you who have been listening in. The recording will be available on our website, and we will also be doing a write-up, and we will hope to capture as many of the additional points that many of you have put in the chat and all of our speakers have said in that as well. I certainly will very much look forward to that. So thank you all again, and look forward to seeing you all virtually or hopefully physically in person one day soon. Thank you.